All right, we are continuing to make our way through the Gospel of John here on the Listener's Commentary. And in this recording, we're going to be looking at John chapter 11, verse 55, down through chapter 12, verse 11. And the setting of this is right after the raising of Lazarus from the dead. So our last recording, the last section in John's Gospel, John chapter 11, 1 through 54, was that powerful and climactic miracle where Jesus describes himself as the resurrection and life, and he raises Lazarus from the dead. And then that scene ends with the Jerusalem leaders fearing the messianic fervor that is growing around Jesus, particularly at Passover time. So they've resolved to kill him, and they're developing a plan to execute him in some sort of way. And in that context, Caiaphas, the high priest, has actually unwittingly prophesied that Jesus' death is for the sake of the nation. Now, all of that took place just weeks before Passover. And in view of how tense things were getting in and around Jerusalem, Jesus has retired to about 12 miles outside of Jerusalem to a small village out in the country. But now, Passover is about to arrive. And Jesus knows that his hour has come, meaning the time for him to lay down his life for the nation and for all of God's children. It's come. And so now he leaves where he's been at out in the country. He returns up the road from Jericho up to the top of the peak of the Mount of Olives, and he returns to the town of Bethany, the very town where he had raised Lazarus from the dead, the town where Lazarus himself lives. And he spends some time with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So here's how the story unfolds. Verse 55 of chapter 11 says, "Now, the Passover of the Jews was near." And we've talked about Passover before, how it's one of the most important feasts of the Jewish yearly calendar. Took place in late March, early April. The population around Jerusalem would swell for festival season. People would travel from all over the empire to come to Jerusalem. And so you have people staying in outlying villages, people camping on the hillsides, massive population swell in Jerusalem. So that's where we're at. The Passover of the Jews is near, the city is swelling with people, and many went up to Jerusalem from the country prior to the Passover in order to purify themselves. So they're going to go get set up, purify themselves for festival season. And when they arrived, John tells us, verse 56, they were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple area, "What do you think? That he will not come to the feast at all?" In other words, people are wondering if Jesus is going to come. They've heard the rumors. They've sensed the tension. They know the leaders want to do with him, and they're like thinking maybe Jesus is going to stay out in the country, stay away for Passover to kind of protect himself and preserve himself. And in saying this, John highlights really Jesus' fame and status. People are here. They're hoping to see him, maybe hoping to hear him. Maybe he'll perform a miracle. And they know the threats against him, so they're wondering if he'll come. Now, verse 57, the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was to report it so they might arrest him. So word now has been spread throughout the region that if anyone has any intel on Jesus, you got to report it back to us so that we can arrest him. Word's out. They want to arrest him. They want to eliminate him. And interestingly, there's actually a little detail in the Talmud that fits well with this. The Talmud is a collection of Jewish writings from about 70 AD to 200 AD that recounts various things from their history. And in this one little section of the Talmud, it's actually talking about Jesus' death. So it says this: on the eve of the Passover, Yeshu, Jesus, was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald, a spokesman, went forth and cried, "He's going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward, plead on his behalf." But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover. What strikes me about that little note from the Talmud is for 40 days, For 40 days leading up to his execution, a herald went forth letting people know, we're looking to get rid of him. We're looking to eliminate him because he's leading Israel into apostasy. And that's really what John is saying here in verse 57, that they had let people know, word had been out that they're supposed to report back to the Pharisees about Jesus if anyone has any intel on him. Therefore, chapter 12, verse 1 picks up, 6 days before the Passover. So the scene has been set. The tension is high. They've sent out a report trying to find Jesus and look for Jesus. Therefore, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And so Jesus has returned from the countryside to the little village of Bethany that's, remember, just less than 2 miles away from Jerusalem, out near the Mount of Olives. It's only 6 days from the actual Passover feast itself, which means it's probably like modern Friday evening. By them, they counted days from evening to evening. So the new day started at roughly 6 in the evening. So maybe it's Saturday, the beginning of Saturday for them, but it would be our Friday evening. And it's therefore 2 nights before the triumphal entry. Trying to piece together the chronology can be a little challenging, but that's what it seems like. That we're 2 nights from the triumphal entry, and Jesus has come into Bethany. And they made a dinner for him there, and Martha was serving. So Martha, as we know from Luke chapter 10, she loves to serve. She's busy in the kitchen, so she's serving the meal. Lazarus is there. He's reclining at the table with Jesus, and so you have Jesus, Lazarus, and maybe some of Jesus' disciples all reclining at the table. Martha's serving the meal. And it's probably, this meal is actually probably the end of the Sabbath meal. So now it's probably Saturday evening by modern standards, the beginning of Sunday for them. It is the evening before the triumphal entry. If that's correct then, and this is a post-Sabbath meal together, here is Jesus with his friends eating this meal. And keep in mind how close Jesus is with his family, right? Chapter 11 told us that he loved them. He had deep affection for them. And you have to imagine that Mary and Martha and Lazarus, with all their connections in Jerusalem, with how close they lived to Jerusalem, they've heard the reports, they've heard the threats, they've heard the warnings from the leaders about letting them know where Jesus is, and they know that the leader's desire is to kill him, to get rid of him. And they also know that their brother, Lazarus himself, is at the heart of all of that. And so now here's Jesus with them, and they prepare this meal, and you have to feel maybe a little bit of energy and tension in the room with all of that context. And I think all of that actually heightens what Mary does next. So Jesus, Lazarus, some of the other guys gather around this meal, and Mary enters into the room. And here's what happens, verse 3. Mary then took a pound of very expensive perfume of pure nard. A pound here would probably be a Latin libra, which is about 11 modern ounces. And nard is this sweet scented oil perfume. And so she comes in with this vial of perfume and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Now, this anointing is probably the same one that's recorded in Mark 14, verses 3 through 9, and Matthew 26, verses 6 through 16. Not 100% clear, but most likely it's that same anointing. And if so, we learn from those accounts in Matthew and Mark that she didn't just anoint his feet, she anointed his head as well. But John focuses on the feet because she wiped his feet with her hair. And this is a humble act of extravagant devotion to Jesus. Not only that, her behavior could likely raise some eyebrows because she's breaking propriety by letting her hair down in public with a group of men, and then she's kind of engaging in a rather intimate act with her hair at the feet of Jesus. And so all of this upsets Judas. Look at verse 4. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who's there around the table in this moment, the one who intended to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the proceeds given to the poor?" Now, 300 denarii is a lot. That's actually about or more than an entire year's wage. And Judas appeals to a well-loved Jewish value, one that Jesus himself obviously shared. That is, care for the poor and needy. That's what he's appealing to. We could have sold, what a waste. We could have sold that perfume if we were just going to get rid of it. We could have taken that money and we could have given the proceeds to the poor. And so he appeals to this value of caring for the poor, but his motives aren't pure. Notice what John adds, verse 6. Now, he said this not because he really cared for the poor, but he was a thief, and he kept the money box, and he used to steal from what was put into it. So Judas, we learn, was actually the treasurer for the disciples and for Jesus' ministry. And he used to just kind of take a little extra when he wanted it, take some for himself. He wasn't actually a very trustworthy treasurer. And he covers up his greed and his thievery with pious-sounding spiritual words about caring for the poor. What he was really hoping was, if we sold that perfume and there's now 300 denarii in there, I could pocket a few of those and use some of that for whatever else I want. And how often is it that people cloak their self-serving aims with pious and spiritual-sounding language? And that's what Judas does here. But Jesus comes to Mary's defense. Verse 7, therefore Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." Now, first off, Jesus isn't running down caring for the poor. He values the poor. His whole ministry has been with the poor. He's fed the poor. He's not running that down. He's saying, this is actually a beautiful and important moment, and there's always going to be poor people you can take care of, but some things actually only come around once, and this is very critical. Notice he says, let her alone for the day of my burial. He knows what's coming. He knows it's on the horizon, and he's not going to avoid it. And so he says, let her keep it for the day of my burial. Now, keep what? Again, it's not totally clear. Some have suggested to keep the oil. Like, let her have that oil so that, she can anoint him for her burial or something like that. That's possible. Or it could be just keep it, meaning keep this moment, keep this act, keep this whole thing as a kind of a memorial in view of his burial. The idea would be, let her have this moment as preparation for the day of my burial. I think that makes far more sense because even if she doesn't fully know what's coming, Jesus does. And so let her have this memory and let her have this moment in view of my coming death and burial. Well, you have that scene happening in this context of a large, probably post-Sabbath meal. And word now gets out that Jesus is in town. And so look at verse 9. A large crowd of the Jews then learned that he was there. And when it says crowd of the Jews, probably here means people from Judea, people from Jerusalem. And so word had spread that Jesus has come to the area. And now they came, not on account of Jesus only, but so that they might also see Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. So if we're correct in how we've reconstructed things, this is what we would call Saturday evening, for them the beginning of Sunday. And it's the post-Sabbath meal, and people are now free to travel. So word had trickled that Jesus was in the area, but they couldn't travel to Bethany because of Sabbath restrictions. But now Sabbath is over. They travel out to Bethany, and they want to see Jesus and Lazarus together. But, verse 10, the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also. Like, we got to get rid of him as well. Because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus. I just find this so ironic and yet so true to life. Rather than consider who Jesus is, they actually plan to get rid of the very evidence of his power. Here's Lazarus. He was dead. Now he's resurrected. Jesus is the one who did it. And their heart is so hard, and they are so obstinate, and their hostility is so deep that rather than saying, maybe we should reconsider who Jesus is, they're like, we got to kill Lazarus too. And their obstinance and their hostility actually bookend this story of Mary's devotion to Jesus. And so notice we have them wanting to get rid of Jesus, giving orders to report, to tell on Jesus so that they can arrest him. And then we have them seeking to kill Lazarus as well because people are believing in Jesus because of him. And in the middle of that, we have this intimate little scene where Mary comes in the middle of a meal and pours out her heart's love and devotion with an extravagant display to Jesus. And I think we should just take a moment and reflect on this story from the vantage point of some of the key players. The leaders, they can't deny Jesus' miracle-working power, but they want to arrest and kill him and Lazarus as well. What kind of motivations and what kind of heart does that take? What drives them to not be able to deny his power, even raising the dead, and yet reject him and want to kill the very one that's the evidence of that power? What drives them to do that? What kind of selfish ambition maybe is at the heart of that? What kind of fear? They have their own vision of what's good for the nation and what God should do, and Jesus doesn't fit. And how often the church and even church leaders have gone their own way like this too, driven by their own ambition, driven by certain fears. Or maybe sit in this scene and look at it from the perspective of Judas. He covers up his greed with pious-sounding sentiment, but his heart is still greedy, and he's looking to serve his own interests. And even though he spent 3 years with Jesus, 3 years as one of the closest people to Jesus, yet just being around Jesus and just being around others who are around Jesus doesn't change his heart. And we need to reflect on that being around Jesus and Jesus' people doesn't guarantee that our heart will change, just like Judas's heart didn't change. Or as you sit in this scene and imagine it and picture it, look at Mary. Imagine it from her perspective. She forgoes social norms and propriety. She enters into the room while these men are gathered there. She lets down her hair to display her affection and devotion and appreciation to Jesus with extravagant devotion and love, costly, 300 denarii, a whole year's wages. What would such devotion look like for me? What would such devotion look like for you? As we reflect on this story, what we see are all these different reactions to Jesus. Nothing has changed in 2,000 years. You'll get all kinds of different reactions to Jesus. People who are trying to use Jesus for their own agenda, people who want to get rid of Jesus because they don't like Jesus, and people who are deeply, deeply devoted to Jesus. And this story really, I think, speaks to us, encourages us, challenges. I think John has included this story to remind us, may we be like Mary, that regardless of all the other voices and all the other reactions, may we have a sincere, heartfelt, deep devotion to Jesus like she did. All right, thanks for tuning in to this session on the Listener's Commentary on the Gospel of John. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. People who give $5 a month, $10 a month, some give $25, some give $100 or more. And they are the ones that really make this ministry possible. So thanks a ton for your support and your generosity. God is using it to bear good fruit in the lives of people all around the world. Thanks a ton for that. If you want to join the team of supporters, you can go to listenerscommentary.com, sign up for the Study Hub, click the Give button, and choose a dollar amount, and you can set up a one-time or even a recurring monthly donation through that Give button. Thanks in advance for your support.